Good evening. I call to order the study session of Lakewood City Council of August 17th, 2015. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Murphy?
Here.
Shakti?
Here.
Kellen? Johnson?
Here.
Wickman? Here. Paul? Here. Harrison?
Here.
Quinn?
Here.
Coop?
Here.
Barraway?
Here.
Royball?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. We have one item on the agenda tonight, and it is as titled Residential Grow Marijuana. I'm going to turn it over to our city attorney, Tim Cox, in just a second, but just to make sure, it seems like I've done more than once recently, is to set clear expectations for tonight. We are not going to see proposed ordinance language at this point. This is the first step. Tim's going to present a number of items, and it'll be our job as council to try to give staff direction for the next time we get together with direction for ordinance language to the extent that we can agree on that tonight. So this is one of those that I think I said to Karen in an email earlier today. It's on one level it seems really simple, and on other levels, as you'll hear shortly, it can be pretty vexing. So we're going to take a good hard look at this tonight. So Tim, you are on. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members. Appreciate you taking time to hear our discussion on this topic tonight. You've spent a lot of time over the years on the topic of marijuana in one form or another, and we're at it again. But at least we tried in this instance to combine a couple of topics together so that you can talk about them once and move on. So, as the mayor said, we're not here to present specific ordinances, but we do want to talk about two proposed ordinances that are related to marijuana. The first is the kind of thing you've seen on a regular basis in your time here, and that is a necessary update to the criminal code. Our police legal advisor, Janet Young, one of her regular functions is to keep track of changes in state law and make sure that our ordinances are fully in compliance, and she's done that for a long time. So sometimes you'll get these ordinances, and they will be a collection of different topics because they're different areas of the law, but all within Title IX. And these are the ones that Margie likes because they have the section-by-section titles to them, Section 9.03, 04, 05, and so forth. So that ordinance will have very little discretion involved for the council because it's necessary information to bring us up to date with state law. The one we're going to spend the time on tonight, and I will come back to that first ordinance, but I just want to lay the groundwork. The ordinance we'll spend most of our time tonight on is the area sort of in between the regulations that have been adopted over the years. We have the medical marijuana ordinances adopted after Amendment 20. We have the recreational marijuana ordinances adopted after Amendment 64. Both of those are constitutional amendments. What we don't have is a set of regulations governing the conduct that the state has said is lawful, that is the use and possession and cultivation of marijuana within homes, within residential areas. And that's an area that has become more a point of discussion in the last couple of years, so we want to make sure that you have the opportunity to address that area. So, getting back to the first ordinance, the one I told you about that Janet Young has prepared, I want to give you an example of what that will do so that you understand where that's coming from. And this is not part of the PowerPoint. We just wanted to highlight a couple of issues here. The simplest example is this. Prior to Amendment 64, every jurisdiction in the state had a provision that said it's unlawful to possess marijuana, for any person to possess up to an ounce of marijuana. Today, we know that's not unlawful for persons 21 and older. Our code still says that it is. So we need to make revisions to the code, one to remove any prohibition against a person 21 or older possessing marijuana in that amount, and one specifying that people under 21 cannot lawfully possess marijuana. Another example would be paraphernalia. There's a restriction on drug paraphernalia for any person. Today, under state law, a person 21 or older can possess marijuana paraphernalia, not other drug paraphernalia, and a person under 21 is still prohibited from possessing any kind of drug paraphernalia. So just to keep in conformance with what Amendment 64 and Amendment 20 have done to marijuana regulation, we have an ordinance that will address those. As it happens, the ordinance would also cover a couple of other areas. As I mentioned there, you never know what areas of the law are going to change in a given year. The draft I've seen has regulation of alcohol possession, things that have changed at the state level, and a couple of isolated provisions about harassment and some other items. But because it has several changes to the marijuana code, we're bringing it forward, planning to bring that forward to you at the same time that the residential neighborhood marijuana regulation ordinance will come forward. So let's get to that if we could. We're calling it regulation of marijuana cultivation in residential neighborhoods. As you know, under Amendment 64, and we'll just have the review that you've heard many times to this point. Going back to November 2000, Amendment 20 created an affirmative defense for possession of marijuana for people with debilitating medical conditions. Didn't really become a factor at the local regulation level until 2009, but that's the backdrop for medical marijuana regulation. In November 2012, Amendment 64 was on the state ballot and was approved by the voters, which authorizes both certain marijuana-related businesses, as allowed by local regulation or not, and the use and possession of marijuana by persons 21 or older. That really was the game changer for the residential regulation. We did, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, adopt an ordinance regulating medical businesses after Amendment 20. After Amendment 64, we adopted an ordinance prohibiting recreational businesses. What we have not covered is what we're going to discuss tonight, restrictions on the lawful cultivation, production, processing, and maintenance of marijuana in residential settings. The city has received in the last couple of years what's been characterized as perhaps 10 or 12 complaints about large operations, grow operations in residential settings, or about outdoor grows, and that's what we're here to address. I want to emphasize that the city cannot prohibit residential grows and possession. We cannot prohibit the maintenance, the cultivation and use of marijuana in residences. State law says that that's lawful. What we want to do, or what recommend that the council should do, is to adopt some moderate standards, some limitations intended to mitigate the impacts. There are potential impacts for the use of marijuana in residential settings, and we want to strike the balance between the rights provided by Amendment 20 and Amendment 64 and the rights that we all have to the quiet enjoyment of our residential property. Some areas of potential regulation that we've considered. Location. Can you grow outdoors or only indoors? Could you grow in a detached structure or only in the primary structure or something attached to it? How do we protect minors from access to marijuana kept in a residential setting? Can marijuana growing be a primary use on a residential property, or should it be only secondary to a residential use? Can we limit the number of plants, and if so, how many should it be, or the area devoted to plants? And ultimately, do we have a right, or can we adopt a provision saying we have a right to inspect residential properties to ensure compliance with code standards that protect health, safety, and welfare, things like the electrical code and the fire code? So that's kind of the framework, the universe of areas that we believe the city is authorized to regulate, again, to mitigate against the negative impacts of marijuana cultivation in a residential neighborhood. So here's what we're suggesting. There's a range of options. Many cities in the metro area and beyond have adopted ordinances of this type, and the range of regulations is fairly broad. What we're proposing, we think, is pretty much down the middle. We're not trying to be an outlier on either end. I think it is a balance, and pretty much everything that we're going to talk about tonight has been at least implemented, if not fully tested, in some other jurisdictions around the metro area. So a lot of time has been spent on the research trying to understand what the limits of existing regulations might be. The first area is where. Where in a residential property, what kind of residential property could you grow marijuana on? Well, as we said, we can't prohibit it on any residential property, but we can, we believe, limit it to the primary residence. Primary residence is a term used in state law in a number of areas, including elections, determining whether a person is a resident of a community for purposes of voter registration or election to public office. Using the same kind of definition, we want to ensure that the person who is growing marijuana or maintaining marijuana lives there, quite simply. We have seen at least one vivid example of something that's, I'm sure, been happening in other communities over the last couple of years, and that is you get a vacant rental property. Somebody rents it and does not live in it and does not rent it to somebody else or let somebody else live in it. They simply use it as a greenhouse. That's obviously beyond the spirit and I would say the letter of Amendment 64 and the state laws that followed it. I don't think any of us wants to see that situation. So if a person can grow, it should be as a secondary function to their primary use of the property as a residence. We're also proposing that the activity of growing marijuana be limited to the primary residence, the structure itself, the home, or an attached garage. We spent a lot of time, believe it or not, talking about this, the options in this area. You can grow outdoors. You can grow in a detached structure. You can grow in a shed of some type. You can grow in a detached garage, an attached garage, or in the residence itself. I think considering the impacts we're trying to mitigate, one would be public safety. So to the extent that there's a threat of theft, risk of theft, the closer the activity is to the occupied part of the residence, the threat perhaps, or the chance of a theft attempt is potentially reduced. And the same would go for an attached garage. There's more control over that area. And also the activity is less obvious. If you have a structure in the backyard or obviously an outdoor garden of some sort, there's going to be a lot more activity surrounding that part of the property rather than what goes on inside the primary residence or garage. The flip side of that, obviously, is we'd recommend that no cultivation activities happen outdoors or in any detached structure. There's also an argument that in an attached garage, you're almost by definition creating a little bit more space between what's going on your property versus the adjacent properties than if it were in a garden, greenhouse, or a detached garage. Wherever it is in the primary residence or in an attached garage, we would recommend requiring that the space be enclosed and locked. And those terms are already defined in state law. They may seem fairly self-explanatory, but there is particular language that is used to ensure that persons under 21 don't have access to that. If the notion that we have is that there would be one set of rules for someone who has a person under 21 living in the property, and slightly more liberal rules for someone who doesn't have any minors or people under 21 on the property, but might at any given time be visited by somebody under 21. But the basic premise would be if there's someone under that age on the property, they should not be able to get at the area where the marijuana plants are being maintained. There would be not really an exception, but another affirmative defense, so that if there were an alleged violation based on a person under 21 having access to the marijuana, it would be an affirmative defense if the person under 21 was actually a card-carrying medical marijuana patient or a caregiver, because state law says a caregiver can be as young as 18 years old. So if someone is recognized as a caregiver, that would be a defense. Again, not an exception from a violation, but a defense to an alleged violation. Now we get to the heart of most of the adopted ordinances in other jurisdictions and the heart of what we're proposing here, and that is a limit on the number of plants. You know that at various times state law has changed to address the number of plants that a person may possess, going all the way back to the Amendment 20 days. You may remember that we talked about up to 6 plants unless the medical professional who recommended this treatment for you says you need more, which is very open-ended. We're not attempting to regulate what a person can possess in total. What we're trying to do is regulate how much of that is happening on the residential property so as to have potential impacts on adjacent properties. And this is an area that has been, as I said, the heart of the regulations adopted in other jurisdictions. What we're suggesting is that there be a limit of not more than 6 marijuana plants cultivated, produced, processed, or maintained per person residing in the primary residence, except that there would be a maximum of 12, regardless of how many people who are qualified to possess marijuana lived on the premises. So you have 1 adult over 21 or older, 6 plants would be the number of plants. If there were 2 adults qualified to possess marijuana, you could have 12 plants. If there were 3 adults qualified to possess marijuana, the limit would still be 12. Keeping a relatively modest number of plants at any one location addresses most of the impacts that we hear about and that we worry about. It means less odor. It means less, obviously, visual impact. It means perhaps a reduced safety risk if there's not as much value maintained in the form of plants in the house. It's really the centerpiece so as to provide a limit on the way that these activities can affect neighboring properties. There's been a wide range of attempts at this. You may be surprised to learn that Boulder, the city of Boulder, has a limit of 6 plants, not allowing for anything beyond that number, regardless of the number of people in the house. In fact, they have drafted their language to say that anything that includes more than 6 plants is a business and is subject to regulation as such. Denver uses language very much like what we've got on the screen here. Those are the major points. There are some other provisions that we think are significant and should be included. You've heard that very often very powerful lights are used in growing operations. That creates a risk of visual impact for people in the area. So there's a proposed provision that would prohibit any light pollution, glare, or brightness that would affect someone of ordinary sensitivity outside the property. We'd have a provision that would require compliance with all applicable building, fire, plumbing, electrical, and mechanical codes. It may seem obvious on its face because you already have to comply with all of those codes, but there are a couple of reasons why you'd want to include that. One is to make clear that by adopting regulations specific to marijuana, we are in no way exempting anyone from compliance with other more general codes, and also so that if you have a provision in your ordinance that says it's a violation of this ordinance to fail to comply with any of the applicable codes, then it creates a separate violation, a little more leverage in the enforcement process. And that would include also zoning restrictions. I mentioned this in the introductory remarks. We spent a lot of time talking about the extent to which we could include this provision, and we finally settled on some language that we think is appropriate and workable. This proposed language would give city inspectors the right to enter property to determine code compliance. And I want to emphasize that. We're not talking about police officers going into property and determining the number of plants. We're talking about the things like the electrical use, the water use, the health safety provisions covered in the electrical code and the building code and the fire code. There would be 3 circumstances under which an inspector could enter the property. One would be with consent, if the property owner or the occupant in control of the property allows that to happen. If that doesn't happen, if there's no consent, there's already a provision in the rules of municipal court procedure that allow for the issuance of inspection warrants if we can show that there's probable cause to believe there might be a code violation on the property. Our inspectors would have the right to seek a warrant from a municipal judge. And in the event of an emergency, there would be the right to enter regardless of whether there's consent or a warrant. You may remember this, but there was a vivid example of the kind of activity. We could not have made this up if it didn't already happen. It really hits right on the mark. Back in March of this year, police sector logs had an entry for a report of a possible marijuana grow in a residential property. And you may remember that an electrician hired to do some work on the property actually called the police after finding makeshift wiring for the grow operation that resulted in electricity being grounded through the house pipes, both water and natural gas. When fire professionals arrived, the natural gas line to the water heater was glowing red. It was so hot. The lieutenant was on the scene. He had a medical marijuana card allowing him to grow 99 plants for his strained back because, as he said, quote, he smokes a lot and has a high tolerance. Unfortunately for him, he had about 200 plants in the basement of the house of all levels of maturity, including many that were at least 5 feet tall. The building inspector came after fire decided that the house was at risk of explosion and had been essentially declared uninhabitable. And it says in the sector logs, even the guys from Excel were horrified by the situation. The tenant was allowed to collect some belongings and get out, and no one was allowed in the house until this situation was addressed. Really an extreme example of how bad things can be and how risky it can be when not done correctly. And that's why we would recommend having this provision in there. It does not implicate anyone's constitutional rights because if there's consent, you can go in. If you have a valid warrant from a judge, you can go in. And in the event of an emergency, the city can go in. So that's, I think, an important piece that we would recommend. We've been talking all about the residential settings because that's what the law allows. We would also suggest, and we're still kind of working on how this would be addressed, whether through zoning or Title IX or someplace else, but a provision simply prohibiting cultivation in commercial buildings. You as a council elected not to allow cultivation facilities when on a couple of opportunities to do so, and this may be a potential loophole where you have people who can grow at home but have an opportunity to rent a warehouse or a commercial building and have a much larger operation, which would not be a commercial cultivation facility, would not be a residential grow, and we think it's worth pursuing that kind of a regulation as well. That's the gist of what we would like to get direction from you on and be able to put together an ordinance. We've looked ahead at the calendar, and I believe these dates are still valid. You'd have pretty much a month to collect public input. This is a legislative matter, so you can talk to your constituents about how they feel about the issue in anticipation of first reading on September 14th and the second reading 2 weeks later, and that would be on both the so-called cleanup ordinance and this cultivation ordinance. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to start out with 3 and then go to Councilor Paul and Councilor Quinn. You kept using the term so many times that I used the initials after the third time. Cultivated, produced, process, and maintain. Are those terms chosen to align with state statute? Okay. Secondly, the right to entry. What is reasonable cause to seek a warrant?
We'd have to refer to the municipal court rules of procedure, but there is language set out already for the equivalent of probable cause. I'd be glad to pull that. I did not bring the language from the court rule. It would be the same as is used today for
Or anything else?
any other type of inspection. Yeah.
While you're there, would you ask what an emergency is?
Follow up, what's from Councilor Harrison, what's an emergency?
Some situation involving imminent risk of public health or safety or welfare. It's fairly general language, and it's in the determination made by an inspector based on the information available that the situation I described from back in March would be a vivid example of that, but there could be other instances where a wiring situation or some risk of fire could present that imminent risk to the public health.
But it's geared primarily toward public safety or resident safety, resident of that house.
The health and safety of the resident and the residents around that property.
Mayor, may I just follow up on that as well then on the emergency? Would that include mold?
Depending on the severity of it and the type of it, yeah, it could.
Anything else on reasonable probable cause? Last question, and I'll yield to Councilor Paul, Councilor Quinn, and then Councilor Harrison. How do we define commercial buildings?
That's one of the things we're still working on. A lot of our zones, as you know, allow for multiple uses, including residential and commercial together. There aren't that many zone districts where residences are not allowed, so that's one of the things that we're still looking at, whether zoning is the appropriate approach or whether we can define commercial in some other way. And it may be as simple as calling it non-residential property, but again, we have to address whether that's a zoning term or some other regulatory term.
Right, so if I'm looking for a loophole and my business is renting properties and I have a place with a house and 3 apartments in back, that's my business.
The chance of a building being used that is both commercial and residential is legitimate, and it's something that we're going to try to address if the council directs us to do so.
Right, okay, Councilor Paul?
Thank you. Mr. Cox, thanks for the presentation. It's very timely and informative, and I think we're on the right track in that the intent of the amendment was not to have commercial grows situated in residential areas. A couple of questions that I have. So if you occupied an accessory dwelling unit as your primary residence, that would then constitute that person's primary residence to where they could grow their, if there's a 12-plant limit.
If we're using the same definition as is used in other contexts, it's the situation you described would constitute the primary residence for that individual. Whether we would, it's a policy question as to whether you would allow for grows to be in that property if you prohibit detached structures generally as a place for cultivation. Would that mean that a person residing in a detached structure as a primary residence, whether they would be allowed to maintain plants there? I would think that because it's a constitutional issue, they probably would. The constitutional right to maintain the plants would probably trump any restriction on the use of detached structures.
And I'll jump into the constitutionality. So we feel comfortable, and it's been tested that, with the protections of Amendment 20 and the doctor's rights and prescriptions or recommendations, that you can say, if a doctor says, well, Mr. Cox, you can have 50 plants. And how do we address that? What's our defense to say, well, no, actually, you can only have 12?
Because we're dictating what can happen on that property,
So it's
not what the
more zoning. Okay.
not what the individual can have the right to possess. What it means, as a practical matter, is if you're limited to 6 plants in your home, and you have a recommendation of up to, as you said, 50, those have to be maintained somewhere else, and probably outside the city limits. That's what's been happening in Denver and in Aurora and Arvada and the other jurisdictions that have regulated this same way.
And then with the codes, I guess because we'd have such a low threshold of plants, they wouldn't be moving into more commercial type codes, because essentially everything that they should be operating should fall under the residential guidelines. But say they have an operation with 12 plants, could that put them over the limit of our codes for what is allowed residential wise as far as electrical or plumbing, to where that would put them out of it? Does that make sense?
Not sure I
Kind of a different level of codes, because even, maybe with 12 plants, they could be using more energy or having things that wouldn't meet our residential code because it's not set up in a normal residence to have something like this. Is that clear?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that came up in group discussions that we had on the proposed language is the use of high-intensity lights, and how even with 12 plants, you might have those in use. Could we go ahead and prohibit their use in connection with marijuana cultivation? Well, those lights have other purposes and can be used lawfully in other settings. Maybe you're growing orchids or
Tomatoes or
whatever it might be. There are legal products that you can buy at a hardware store and use in your home. So it'd be difficult to prohibit them in one context and allow them in another. I'm not sure if that gets to the
yeah,
heart
no,
of your
that
question.
that helps out a lot. And then I guess this goes back to the mayor's question with the phases of growth. That covers that as well. So 6 plants, period. It doesn't matter what stage of growth they're in, right? It's not, because doesn't the Constitution reference flowering versus?
Yes, it talks about 6, which no more than half can be
Yes.
flowering at any given time. The language we would propose would conform to the Constitution and certainly would not be more lenient than what the Constitution.
It would be essentially 3 and 3 or whatever that mix is.
That's what I anticipate. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Quinn, Councillor Harrison, Wickman, and Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Is there any legal reasoning behind allowing 12 plants maximum per property versus 6 plants, which is what I understand Boulder allows?
It seems as if there's been sort of a comfort zone there. There's no legal distinction. Both have relevance to the Constitution, right? Because 6 has been used, and 2 people could use 12, and that fits in with what the Constitution and the state law provides. But there's not a decision out there that says you can allow this many and not that many. It's just an area that has hit home with a number of jurisdictions. And again, we don't recommend being on the fringes of regulation unless we have a particular reason why we should.
Okay. Has Boulder's ordinance with the 6-plant limit been challenged in court? Do you know?
Not that I know of, no.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cox. I appreciate it very much. First question, kind of generic. You've talked about the group and the we that you're talking about that were involved in some of this. Who are those people?
It evolved over time, but generally speaking, we had representatives of the police department, including sector liaison units. People are out there talking with residents about these issues. Representatives of the clerk's staff, because they're involved in the ordinance process. Code enforcement, obviously the city attorney's office, and I think that's the extent of the players changed as we went through the process, but those were the groups involved. Yes, thank you. Public Works, the building division, was also involved because of the building code implications.
And primarily, I'm assuming it was to make sure that whatever suggestions you would give to us, that it would be workable and that could be some enforceable.
Workable and enforceable to some extent necessary. There may have been issues that would not be considered enough of a problem to regulate. So we're trying to find out what's really going on out there, what kinds of problems are we seeing, and how can we address them using a variety of methods.
Thank you. The next question would be, several months ago we had a discussion about odor.
Yes.
And I was wondering, we didn't talk about odor in what we looked at here. Is that something that we can do?
It is an area that has been part of the regulations adopted elsewhere. Sometimes with simple provision along the lines of what we suggested for light pollution, that you can't have an impact, an odor that's detected by a person of ordinary sensitivity off the property. Sometimes, at least one instance that I can think of, there's been a requirement that anyone cultivating marijuana in their home must install some sort of ventilation system to address the odor problem. That seems to me to be sort of on the edge of regulation. We have that kind of language for the licensed medical marijuana businesses in the city, and it's a condition of their license for a person to engage in lawful conduct on their premises with a product that happens to give off an odor. I mean, you can analogize it to tobacco smoke. You can smoke in your own home, and there's no prohibition against that smoke drifting off the property and being detectable by somebody off site. There's also an enforceability issue with the activity being lawful on all properties. If I walk out on my back porch and I detect the smell and it bothers me, and I think that's coming from over there, without the absolute right to enter the property immediately and verify that there are in fact more than 12 plants, and that's why the odor is stronger or whatever is causing it. We don't even know that the odor is coming from that property. It could be coming from another property. And there's no threshold where 12 plants don't emit an odor, 18 plants do. So finding that probable cause to say, we think there's something happening on this property that is beyond what is lawful, and that's what's affecting somebody else's sensitivities, that's a difficult area to get into. It has been done, and it's something we can certainly look at as we get direction from the council and try to address that best we can. We did not include it because it is a difficult problem to enforce.
Mayor, may I follow up on that? Sure. Odor? But there are also, those who choose to can also smoke marijuana on their back porch. So they could have less than 6 plants and they're just smoking on their back porch. So the odor could be from somebody actually smoking it as opposed to just the growing of it.
That's right. Their odor comes from at least 2 different activities, the stage of cultivation and the actual use of the product.
Yeah, it is a dicey one because, people may not like the smell of curry or the fish that somebody's cooking next door. And cigarette smoke to me is always the classic, especially in apartment complexes. And lately we've gotten a few complaints about people who have chimeneas and outdoor wood-burning fireplaces or fire pits, and people don't like the smell of that smoke either. So that it kind of runs into a real gray area. I as much as I appreciate burning cottonwood, yes. As much as I appreciate the concern, because I have one of those sensitive noses, it's just a difficult one, I think, for our police department, our code enforcement officers to actually be able to enforce.
However, my thought would be is if there are less plants in a location, perhaps the smell would also be less. So we'll hope for that. What about additional fire codes? Specifically, one of the things I was wondering is, should we require a sprinkler system, especially attached to the house?
Well, it kind of follows what we said about a ventilation system. This is lawful activity unless you can show that there's a particularized risk of fire from the activity. A small number of plants in a small confined area has less risk than a larger operation with the kind of wiring we heard about in that other scenario. So it's a cost benefit. Is there enough of a risk to justify that significant expense to someone who may be a tenant on the property and has the right to grow if their lease allows for it, but may not have the ability to install that sort of a system?
Follow up?
But I just follow up to that, and I think that was somewhat along the lines of what I was asking, but from what I heard from you, it's more the matter is if you required sprinkler for this, you would then require that if you were growing tomatoes or orchids in your basement or whatever room you were doing that.
That's right. The activity that creates the risk may not be specific to marijuana cultivation, and we don't have any ability to say that other activity requires a sprinkler system, unless the fire code says that's the case.
Okay. I think I'm done for now. I may have some more later.
Sure. I expect this to go on for a little while, and it should. Councilors Wickman, Johnson, and Paul.
Slightly different matter. You've used the term residential. It seems to be used rather generically. Are we making any sub-distinctions as to different types of residential? What I'm leading up to, would it be possible to prohibit it in multifamily residential and limit it only to large lots or something like that? Can we break that down?
We don't think we have the ability to prohibit it in a residential setting, whether it's an apartment, a condominium, or a detached single-family home. What some jurisdictions have done is try to recognize that a smaller unit in a facility, a building of many smaller units, may have greater impacts on the adjacent properties than a single-family home. So some cities you'll see will regulate the number of plants or the amount of space used so that there's a greater number for a single-family home and a smaller number for an apartment, for example. So you can attempt to recognize the differences between the two settings, but I think we'd still have to stop short of an outright prohibition.
I'm going to ask a follow-up while they're chatting. So what you defined it as primary residence. So that could mean both property ownership, and it could also mean a rental property but that is their primary residence, correct?
Yes, I have the language from state law in other contexts that we are holding on to for this purpose. And it's a little bit wordy, but it gives you an idea of what we'd be looking at. Primary residence means that place in which a person's habitation is fixed and to which a person, whenever he or she is absent, has the present intention of returning after a departure or absence therefrom, regardless of the duration of the absence. I got that?
A lot of billable hours in that one.
Residence is evidenced by actual daily physical presence, use and occupancy of the primary residence, and the use of the residential address for domestic purposes, including but not limited to, you'll love this, slumber, preparation of meals, package delivery, vehicle and voter registration, or credit and utility billings. For purposes of this chapter, a person shall have only one primary residence. Maybe this is the geek in me, but you'd be fascinated by the cases that talk about primary residence in the election context. There have been some really interesting decisions involving people who lived in a place and for one reason or another went somewhere else, and the determination that had to be made was, what is the intent? And that's what it largely turns on, is your intention that be the place where you reside. Whether you slept there last night or last week or not, is that where you intend to be? And it is not determined by ownership. So there's a long answer to a short question.
So
Follow-up?
on a follow-up to that, because we had an instance where there was a gentleman who rented his home to somebody and they turned it into a grow, and he didn't know about it. Is there some provision that gives that property owner the right to be notified that their renter is going to be doing this? Or
We
does
haven't
that fall under
contemplated
confidentiality?
that kind of language. The expectation is that in a rental situation, the owner has the ability to control what kinds of activities go on there. And I'm personally aware of one situation where a landlord had prohibited the use of marijuana in one of the units, and it resulted in that tenant leaving. We can certainly look at some indication of notifying the property owner, but it's not an area we normally would regulate in.
Councilor Johnson?
Actually, I'd like to comment to that. I have rental property, and our police department has an awesome program of crime-free housing. When you are part of that program, you have a contract. My renters sign it, I sign it, if there's anything illegal going on the property, and I've also got in the contract any marijuana or any drugs, it's reason for immediate eviction, no questions, that's the end of the deal. And so there is a way to do that. You
Right.
just have to be proactive with it.
That's right. It's in the hands of the owner to decide what restrictions beyond illegal activity you want to.
So, are they allowed to drink?
I don't have alcohol in the contract, but I do have marijuana and drugs and domestic violence, yeah.
And I guess a follow-up to that is what you're saying is that's more of a civil matter between the rentor and the owner. That's something the city wouldn't venture into.
Right. Illegal activity is a city matter regardless, but if it's legal activity and the landlord wants to prohibit it, that is a matter of contract between the two parties.
Right. Same with cigarette smoke. The landlord could say, I don't want you to smoke cigarettes in this apartment or this
Pets
house.
or
Right.
any other area like that.
Mike,
I think you still have the floor, Ramey.
thank you. Also, my contract does have cigarette smoke. I'm tired of washing walls. Your program for crime-free housing is awesome. I would recommend it actually for anybody. Well, in trying to prepare for tonight, our packet was empty. So I called Colorado Municipal League, and they sent me ordinances for about 5 different cities and also a document that they prepared as well. I have real problems with marijuana just on an individual basis. For me personally, I disagree with it. When we've got medical marijuana and a caregiver and growing these, the patient is supposed to have a permit from the physician, or I'd like to see us include in our ordinance that we have a copy of that here at this city, and that they have a copy of it on premise. I think that's reasonable. And
Can I
that
just
if
clarify?
that caregiver, for whatever reason, does not have that patient anymore, they need to tell us immediately that they don't have them. I'd like to see that kind of
Can I
language.
just
in
clarify,
this.
are we talking about medical marijuana
I
or
am right
recreational
now.
marijuana?
We're talking about any residential cultivation of marijuana,
Including medical.
including medical.
Right.
Okay.
But there are some constitutional issues involving privacy, the identity of the patients. In most contexts, and the Chief could correct me if I'm wrong, dealing with the caregivers when, particularly before Amendment 64 was passed, to verify that someone was a caregiver, you could ask for proof, and that proof might consist of a patient's card, but the name would be blacked out, and it would just be a registration number because that patient was entitled to privacy, and even the police department could not discern the name of the patient. You couldn't contact the state registry and say, I've got number 36415, can you tell me who that is? That would not be available information. So I'm not sure the city could require that it be disclosed either. And because everybody can grow now in their residence, the caregiver-patient relationship is still valid and still important in certain contexts, but when we're trying to determine, do you have the requisite number of plants or the maximum number of plants or more than that number, it doesn't matter as much whether that person is a caregiver for 1 patient or 5 or none.
Can we limit the amount of patients a particular caregiver has in their home?
No, that's another area reserved for state law. But again, by setting a limit on the number of plants that can be maintained in the residence, regardless of the number of people there, that limit would apply to both medical and recreational.
Is it possible to have part of the ordinance where if you want to grow medical marijuana for someone that you have to have a permit and charge for a permit? Because there probably is enforcement. We haven't talked about the cost of enforcement.
I don't believe the cities have the authority to license caregivers, which is what that would amount to. I'm not aware of anybody that's attempted to do that. I don't think I think that would run afoul state law.
Okay. Also, when I visited a grow center, all of the plants were tagged. Is it possible to have that as part of the ordinance where we tag the plants? We know what their harvesting history is. Talk to that, Tim.
We'd have to look at that. I have not had occasion to read through the State Department of Revenue regulations recently, but there are a lot of details about the cultivation process that are addressed in those state regulations. So that may be a matter that's already addressed by the state. We'd have to look into that.
I'd sure like to see if we could have that part of our ordinance.
As a follow-up, I do believe the state does require the tagging system for any medical.
I want to say I think that's right. I just have not.
It has to be assigned to a patient. You have to prove and say, this is for so-and-so.
Right.
So it's
Are we
only for
enforced?
medical.
What I believe.
Probably can't disclose.
Well, are we enforcing that, or are we even looking at that as far as tagging plants?
So just to clarify, the State Department of Revenue is responsible for the tagging and tracking of medical marijuana plants, correct?
Yeah, there's a.
Kevin?
Yeah, that is the case. Chief, step in.
Yes. If we get called on an investigation where we identify plants that aren't properly tagged, we will call the State Department of Revenue to come out and assist us with that investigation to see if there's a violation at the state level. So yes, we'll do those investigations jointly.
But that's
So then we do have the plants that are medical marijuana now that they are tagged, and we have a history of their harvesting?
Yes, we do have that, yes.
Okay.
Do we require that with, I think we're getting into a part of the Constitution, particularly as it relates to caregivers, where there's a lot less clarity than there is with regard either to the commercial marijuana or the medical marijuana.
I know it gets tricky. Please tell me again, can we charge in order to be growing to help pay for the enforcement?
It's lawful activity in the residential setting, and I don't believe that we have the authority to
Permit?
because
For
again,
lack
that
of
would be
another
the
word.
cost of acquiring a permit or a license for what is otherwise legal activity.
Okay. I'm just curious, how much are we spending on enforcement for marijuana? Do you have any ballpark figures on that?
From strictly from the enforcement standpoint, not the licensing or the background investigation piece of that, I don't have figures on that. I think Mr. Cox alluded earlier that we had roughly 10 to 12 concerns of this nature about large grows in residential areas. So that gives some indication that while it's certainly not a common situation, it does happen from time to time. So these types of situations aren't overwhelming us or causing us a great deal of cost, but they are occurring.
Okay. Is there some way that when a caregiver no longer has a patient, that they must notify the city? Or are we tracking? How does that work? Talk to me, Tim.
We would not be tracking that information because, again, for purposes of our proposed ordinance, the rules would be the same whether someone was a caregiver for a patient or was maintaining the plants for their own use or for the use of someone else on the property. You'd have the limit of 12, and if they were for your own use and your spouse's use, so be it. If they were for two different patients that you have elsewhere, the same rules would apply. So the fact that a caregiver no longer had a particular patient, again, we wouldn't be able to know who that patient was, and if that patient went away, the caregiver occupant could replace them with 12 plants for personal use, and the impact would be the same. So we're trying not to distinguish between the two types of grows any more than we need to.
Okay. Also, we have specifically said that the grow is in the primary residence.
That's what we're proposing, yes.
Right. What about making sure that it is not in rental property or multifamily units?
That gets back to Councilor Wickman's question. Whether it's a rented space or not, the occupants, barring any lease provisions to the contrary, the occupants would have the same right to use and maintain plants as the owner of a property would. Again, we could take into account that an apartment is typically smaller than a detached single-family home, and you could have sort of graduated or different limits based on the size. I don't think we want to get into a truly graduated. If you have up to 600 square feet, you can have this many plants. If you have up 600 to 1,000 square feet, you can have that many plants. But a general distinction between a multifamily unit and a single-family unit has been tried elsewhere.
I know, because I've seen it in some of the other ordinances. That is true. Also, do we have in this ordinance that it must be grown under lock and key with only the person that is growing it have access, period?
What we would have is it must be in an enclosed, locked space, as both of those terms are defined in state law, and not accessible to anyone under 21.
Is it possible to have it so it's not accessible to anyone except the person who's growing it?
That would require us to know who's growing it for what purpose, and again, that's with the advent of Amendment 64. We don't really have any ability to inquire into that. Are there two adults on the premises? Then you can have up to 12 plants. Is there only one adult on the premises? Then you can have only 6 plants. But anyone 21 or older has the right to possess marijuana, whether they use it or not, and whether they're growing it or not. They have the right to possess it in their homes. So we wouldn't want to make it a violation for the spouse of a grower. The grower uses, the spouse does not. You're not going to make it a violation for the spouse to have access to those plants. That's getting into an area that we wouldn't be able to regulate.
Okay. Also, what about regulating the type of light bulb? I saw that in some of the ordinances.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit because there are high-intensity lights used, but as we were saying a little while ago, those lights have other uses. And so to say you're prohibited from using high-intensity lights for marijuana grows, but you can use them in another part of the house for a different purpose, such as the tomatoes or other plants that require a lot of light, we'd have to be consistent and either prohibit them as a safety hazard or not at all. And if the fire code would allow the use of those lights, we wouldn't be able to prohibit their use for one purpose versus another. But the fire and electrical codes would always be a factor, and so the use of those would have to be in conformance with what the electrical code already says.
Because I've noticed that is the case in some of the ordinances. They have included that kind of language.
Yes, and we considered that, but again, thought, how can we prohibit it for this use, this lawful use, and not prohibit it for the growing of tomatoes, to use that example again.
Okay. Did you already talk that maybe before somebody can grow, they need to have the property inspected for the type of electrical and ventilation? The amount of electricity that it requires for this is phenomenal, and it really does need to be done by an electrician, not just my husband.
Again, by limiting the number of plants, we're trying to reduce the effect of excessive electrical use. We have not considered requiring a preliminary inspection, again, because it's lawful activity, and growing a couple of plants probably would not involve any additional use of electricity. And again, would not be any different from someone growing something else that uses the same amount of electricity. I don't pretend to be an expert on the electrical code, but I know that's where we turn to find out what someone can and can't do. Our ordinance would require compliance with all of those codes. And so if there's reason to believe someone is not in compliance, we'd have the opportunity to inspect.
And then also I noticed in some of the ordinances they had language regarding combustible butane, and there were a couple of others that you could not store.
You may recall we addressed that in a prior ordinance to prohibit the use of volatile hazardous substances in hash oil production. Since then, the state legislature has addressed that with a provision that makes it a drug felony to use a hazardous substance in the production of hash oil. So at the state level, it's already a drug felony, and we would not want to regulate it as something less than that. So I think our proposal would include a repeal of the hash oil prohibition we already have, so that it is addressed as a felony at state law, and we would not duplicate efforts. And that's, the chief is nodding that's his recommendation as well.
To kind of circle back to Karen's comment on odor, most of these ordinances do have provisions regarding odors. And I think that's actually a fair thing for us to be looking at as well.
It is something we have looked at, and we'll continue to look at it if that's the council's desire. I'm aware that a lot of jurisdictions have done that. As we've read the language, we've gone through a number of scenarios that call into question the ability to enforce that kind of provision in any meaningful way. And as we talked about a little earlier, there are other odors that may be offensive to someone in an adjacent property that we can't prohibit. And this being lawful activity would seem to be the same. But we can certainly look at that if that's what the council wants us to do.
I think we should. I would just like to say, in going forward, when we have substantial public policy issues like this, and we have the wonderful resource of the Colorado Municipal League, let's use them. They sent me multiple ordinances, and you get an opportunity to see what other cities are doing. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can learn from what they're doing, and I think it's fair that we should do discovery with them as well and ask them, since these are all from 13. I mean, we're kind of behind the curve on this, frankly. Call them and see, what have you learned from what you're doing? What can we do different? What should we do better? And have a little bit more to read and to go off of. I'd like to see
We have the same resources. We've done the same research and have those ordinances, and that's been the basis for what we've been doing over the last several months in preparation for this. We did not want to provide multiple examples to all of you. We feel like that's asking you to do the research, which you're certainly welcome to do on your own. We wanted to do that for you and come in with a recommendation, but did not want to give you something that was set in, or appeared to be set in stone. We want to be clear that you have the discretion to give us direction on strengthening or weakening certain provisions here, but we did the same research that you're talking about. We're using those resources.
Well, I would just like to say it'd be nice to have it provided rather than each of us have to go and dig it out ourselves. Just put it in a packet for us. We have the option then of reading the ordinances if we want to or not. You learn a lot from this stuff, frankly.
Yeah, and we have, and we're trying to consolidate that down in a useful format. If council wants 10 examples from other cities, we'd happily provide that, but what we've done is try to take that information and package it in a useful form for you.
Yeah, I just would like to add, I know, Tim, you're one of the experts out there in this area and have been for a long time, so I feel quite confident in the research that you've brought us and the information that you've brought us. I know you're very active with the Colorado Municipal League on these issues, so what was brought to us tonight is I think, very nice. There are other ordinances out there. You are our city attorney, so I think you understanding our community and knowing, I think you brought together a nice buffet of choices that we can look at, and we can go further if we want, or we don't have to. So I think that this was very nice and very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. And our goal was to seek your direction so that if any of these things don't sound like they're hitting the sweet spot for you, that's what we need is direction on which way to go with them, and we'll bring back something that we think meets your needs.
Shakti. Sorry.
I could use a little more background on the difference between recreational and medical and what's allowed and when is tagging required and why. Just sort of to understand that whole
Right. I'll defer to the chief on the tagging issues. Has obviously been involved with that, and then address your other questions.
And I am by no means an expert on the tagging, but the tagging started with the medical marijuana rulemaking, and it was a concept that we in law enforcement promoted, and that was the seed to sale tracking of the marijuana plants. So that they could be regulated and monitored, so that there weren't more plants than there were people were authorized to grow.
So that it wasn't being grown to be sold at least on the black market.
Exactly. I guess the best way to respond to that is I think we've had mixed results with that program. I'm not sure it is as effective as we had originally envisioned it being.
Well, it's a really different situation now that we have recreational, too.
Yes. And the caregiver situation adds new complexities, plus some of the licensing for users to have an increased number of plants adds even more complexity. So I don't think it's ever achieved the goal that law enforcement envisioned, where we'd have a strict tracking from seed to sale.
And how many plants is a recreational person allowed to grow?
Today, there's no limit on how many can be grown in a residential property.
As long as they're grown for your personal use.
Right.
So the caregiver might grow more because it doesn't have to be for their personal use.
Well, to use an example that I think came up for the police department, again, prior to Amendment 64, is there'd be a report of a large-scale grow operation, and the police would come to the property, and maybe they'd be allowed in, but in any event, they get the opportunity to see what's there, and they find, 80 plants. And they say, well, this is more than you're allowed. Well, no, because I'm a caregiver, and I'm allowed 6 plants for each of my 5 patients, and 4 of my patients, their doctor has said they should have more, so I've got an extra 20 plants for this patient, an extra 7 plants for that patient. And we don't even have the ability to verify that those patients exist. We have to take it on faith that they are within the program, the card-carrying program, and that the caregiver has the ability to maintain that number of plants. Very open-ended. So the main purpose of this is to put some hard limit on what can happen on any property.
In that situation, the point of the tagging is that clearly that person isn't going to use all of that marijuana. And so the tagging is to show that they have some legal use for the product. And with this proposal, it would be a small enough quantity that theoretically it could be staying in the house.
That's the idea, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Before you leave, Chief, if you had a magic wand and could go back to when this originally started without all of the problems that we've had, how would you like to have a law written that would be enforceable and would meet the needs of the citizens? Because I think your department is the one that's having to deal with the most of this.
Well, and that's a great question. In response to what Mr. Cox said earlier, we did have a voice in this committee, and we were instrumental in shaping much of the language that is involved in this proposal. So our voice has been heard, and it is reflected in this ordinance, or this proposed ordinance. The one thing that I do struggle a bit with, and that's Councilor Johnson's request for a smell violation. And we have a current noise ordinance which has, for purposes of this discussion, some ambiguity to it. But with noise, we have things that we can equate it to by saying, well, I heard the noise and it was louder than I could talk to somebody who was standing next to me and we couldn't hear each other. So we had some relevancy with regard to noise. With smell, I don't know that I still have that same ability to go into court and say, this is how I equate the smell in terms of relevance. It smelled this big or this big or this big. And then the burden of proof is on the prosecution and in essence, the police department to overcome that this smell caused, in my mind, the only way you could regulate smell is either a yes or no. It's either you do smell it or you don't smell it.
Doesn't have decibels. Is what
It
you're-
doesn't have decibels. I guess that's where it becomes a little more difficult to enforce. And so if that's the path that council would like to go on, I think it has to be something that's a yes/no. But that just gets to a couple of the things. I think this is getting at the essence of what's best for our community, what's safest for our community, while at the same time respecting the Constitution and the legalities that are presented there.
Thank you. Do you feel like you're having very many calls where there's what I would call excessive numbers of plants in a location?
Well, again, we've had roughly 10 or 12 of these over the course of the last 18 months or so. So that's less than one a month.
That's not as many DUIs as that you have to deal with.
Oh, no. We get way more DUIs, yes.
Thank you.
Any more questions, comments? All right, we have, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just
Got
I
Tom
may-
and Cindy. We've got some decision points to move to.
Oh, well, I tell you what, I'm just going to wait then.
Okay.
No, I didn't have any questions. I'm just going to say, so in a nutshell, basically, we're saying whether you have medical marijuana plants or recreational marijuana plants, the most, if you have more than one adult over 21 in the household that you could have is 12. So it doesn't matter if the medical caregiver has 3 patients and the neighbor can have 50 plants. He or she can only have 12.
That's
In
right.
that household.
For his or her business purposes or personal purposes, that caregiver would have plants somewhere else in some other context. But for residential use in our community to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people around that property and on that property, the limit would be 12 regardless.
And that would then also have to be grown in a locked room, an enclosed locked room. So they also have to have the space then within their property that they can lock off. Okay, thank you.
I just have one other kind of comment to make. The comment about HIPAA, because that's the world that I live in and day out. Every single one in this room, probably, if you reached into your wallet, have an ID card that has your name on it, that says that you have insurance. When you go into the pharmacy puts your name on that prescription, and they don't mark it out when you leave that. The idea of these people marking their names out on the medical marijuana cards, I'm not sure that really truly is a HIPAA violation. I think it is a way to get somebody else's medical marijuana card and use it and not pay tax. My comment. Thank you very much.
Ramey.
I just have a question, Tim, one more. Do we have any way of knowing or tracking if one patient has 3 or 4 or 5 people growing marijuana for him? Medical marijuana.
Yeah, keeping in mind that we, under hardly any circumstances can we determine the identity of a patient. That's kind of the end of the trail right at the beginning. It's hard to track it back to anyone, caregiver 1, 2, or 3, if you don't know who you're dealing with.
This is ripe for gaming, I think.
I think it has been for several years now. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to attempt to synthesize and. Sorry.
Just response to that. One patient can get as much marijuana as they want, can't they? They can just go buy it. So we're not regulating how much marijuana a person has. What we're regulating is how much can be in a house, which is growing, which is a problem because it affects the neighbors. Right.
Yeah, that's generally true.
Okay. If I can, I'll spend a minute and a half here trying to kind of synthesize the proposal and also a couple of potential additions. So given the fact that the premise is that under Amendment 20 and Amendment 64, medical marijuana is legal, and the possession and use for home consumption of up to an ounce of recreational marijuana is legal. So that does sort of begin to set the threshold for what we can and cannot do. We can't, I think I heard Tim say, we can't prohibit the growing of the plants, but we can adopt reasonable limitations to mitigate perceived negative impacts. So the proposal consists of the marijuana may be, and this is language from state statutes, cultivated, produced, processed, and maintained only at the responsible person's primary residence. No marijuana can be cultivated, produced, processed, and maintained outdoors or in any detached structure. And I think we learned that an accessory dwelling unit would be a residence, not a detached structure. It should be, by the way, a secondary use, not a primary use of the home. That was a comment that Tim made. So therefore, it would be okay to do it in an attached garage, not a detached garage, right? That space must be enclosed and locked. It would be an affirmative defense if it's accessible to a person under 21 who is a medical card holder. I wasn't sure. Caregiver, sorry.
No, both, actually.
Both. All
A
right,
patient under 21 or a caregiver down to age 18.
All right. Maximum number of plants, no more than 6 plants. For one person, no more than, in the primary residence, max of 12 plants per person in the primary residence. And the thought behind this was by limiting the number of plants, we're eliminating the number of limiting. I combine limiting and mitigating and got a word that doesn't exist. We're mitigating the potential impacts of power and theft and that sort of thing. We want to look at no excess light pollution, glare, brightness, and must comply with applicable fire, building, plumbing, electrical, and mechanical codes. We want to write in a WRIT, a right, RIGHT of entry, for the code inspectors to determine compliance, and the standards there would be consent of the resident, a warrant under existing standards of probable cause, or an emergency, which we're going to attempt to define.
Yeah, I think something along the lines of imminent risk of to the public health, safety, or welfare.
All right. And we're going to not allow it in commercial buildings. We're going to attempt to hone in on commercial to avoid any gaming or loopholes there. Try to define what commercial is. We've talked about some other things like odor, HVAC units, power, inspections before you're permitted to grow. We've sort of nibbled around the edges of an idea of basing the number of plants you can have on the square footage or something in apartment versus duplex versus single family home versus mansion. I don't know exactly how that would work. So those last, odor, HVAC, limit based on square footage, and what was the other one? I just said we're not part of your original proposal, right?
Correct.
Okay. What have I missed in terms of what else we've talked about?
I think sprinklers was one topic that was brought up as well.
So I'll use as a foundation for our basis of going forward the proposal that Mr. Cox gave us tonight. And remember, we're just giving them a recommendation to write an ordinance. We always have the opportunity when we get to second reading. And again, this is a legislative matter. We can talk about this openly. We can add or subtract or substitute as we see fit, right? So there'll be opportunity for amendments on the night of second reading, for example.
Yes.
And conversations could go on between council about proposed amendments, correct? Because it's legislative. Okay. So I would put out there, for purposes of moving this forward tonight, that we accept Mr. Cox's proposal as a foundation for this new ordinance with the refinements that we've asked for on defining commercial, emergencies, etc. I would just opine here that some of the other suggestions might. I recognize that there's zeal about this issue, and there's some validity to that zeal. My zeal is about the Constitution. You know, my mother, bless her heart, grew orchids, and if it had been the days when there were helicopters flying around looking for light and heat, they would have descended on our apartment and on the house that she eventually passed away in. She used a lot of power. She grew orchids and tomatoes and that kind of thing. I think we need to be very thoughtful about that. Odor, this gets into the enforceability issue, kind of the chief's yes, no. Skunkweed puts out odor. Chinese elm and cottonwood in my neighborhood is the thing. If I could write a law, that would be it. I happen to like curry, but I know some people don't. I think we want to be very careful about that. That's just my own opinion. But again, we all have the opportunity to do what we want to do. And just make sure we are applying whatever we do. The standards we're applying also apply to other products that are legal to grow in your home, whether it's basil or anything else. All right, Councilor Johnson.
Thank you. Just one more thing I thought about. We have that you can go into a home with consent, warrant, and emergency. Have we ever considered a complaint? And in one of the ordinances that was talking about the increased traffic coming to and from a home, I mean, it's gamed.
It's all
Or just complaint.
premised on the idea that someone's unhappy about activity on the property. It's not that we're making drop-in inspections to find out what's happening. Someone makes a complaint about activity that they think might be in violation of the law, and we have people go out, whether it's code inspectors or police, go out and take whatever evidence is available, ask for consent. If consent is denied, but they have the basis for proceeding, that's when we go to court and seek the warrant. So the complaint process sort of precedes all of those options for getting into the property. We wouldn't be getting in unless someone said that there was a problem there.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Thoughts, Tom? Cindy, you were going to say something earlier. Cindy? Oh, sorry.
I agree with moving forward with what we have here, but one change that I'm probably going to support would be, it seems like we've identified some impacts. Obviously, smell, electrical use, water, etc. It seems like the most practicable way to limit those impacts would be to further limit the number of plants. I mean, I'm just telling you what I'm thinking. To make it essentially go with the bolder approach and make it 6 plants per primary residence. At least that's what I'm thinking right now. Just for residents, yes.
Not resident.
Right. I'm sorry. Yes, I should have been clear about that. Per residence. That's kind of my thinking at this point. Is that's the most practicable way to go about this. I don't think we should get into smell at all. That's something that's very difficult to do anything with. You know, we've mentioned a number of other things that emit a fairly pungent odor, and other things that smell like marijuana that are not marijuana. Some people burn sage for ceremonial purposes, and people think that smells like marijuana. So anyway, those are just kind of my thoughts at this point. But otherwise, I think you've done a great job on this. I like everything about the proposed, or the outline of the proposed ordinance. Thank you.
Councilor Barraway, and then Councilor Shakti.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Tim, as well, and the Chief for the presentation tonight. And, that is typically how we have done things in this council, is that we have a group of people who are involved with the processes that go on behind the scenes, whether it's the enforcement piece that may come along, the licensing, what may happen if you have code enforcement going out there. City Council isn't normally involved in that process. We look to you with your guidance to bring to us your recommendations, which you've done tonight. Then at that point, from a City Council perspective, we can talk to each other. We can go out and talk to our constituents. When you start with a completely blank slate, I think that too much devil in the details can occur and maybe raise expectations for those who think, oh, yeah, we're going to be able to do this, and this. Well, maybe we're not, because we haven't yet talked to the experts in the field back on this side of the fence who are the ones who are going to have to enforce whatever ordinance we put into play. So I appreciate the process that we had tonight, the information that's been given to us. All you need to do is sometimes read the newspapers. You can see what's going on in other communities, the impacts that have occurred. And then as a council member, the calls that you may get, the complaints of, I think too many people are going to this house on a regular basis. We turn it over to our public information officer, and she sends it to their respective departments, and they look into it on our behalf or on behalf of the citizen who's made the complaint. I would agree with Tom. I wouldn't support necessarily an odor piece of that. All you need to do is been the person in the dorm who cooked curry on a regular basis when mom sent it home with you when you went home to visit, and suddenly everybody's coming knocking on your dorm room door and asking, what are you making? I said, it's curry, and nobody liked it except me. And that can raise more complaints and more problems in our community with neighbors actually, picking on each other because they don't like this or that. I've never liked tobacco smoke, but people are allowed to lawfully smoke cigarettes in their backyard, their front yard. They're lawfully allowed to smoke marijuana on their property. So how do you overcome that lawful part of our Constitution that the citizens voted in, not us as City Council, but the citizens of the state of Colorado voted in? So on that, everything else I agree with that the mayor had mentioned, except the idea about putting in odor.
Shakti.
So maybe all the wards heard about this, but this is something I have been hearing about some in Ward 3. And I think it's wonderful that we're contemplating these reasonable regulations. There really are impacts on neighbors, and so we need to consider how many plants can be grown in a residential area. I don't know where I stand on the right number, 6 or 12, and I'm concerned about the constitutional issues. Am I right that the Constitution says that an individual can grow 6 plants?
Yes, generally. It can possess that amount is what it really gets to, is how much can you possess.
Oh. But there's a right to grow, too.
But I want to be careful here because it does not give every person an unfettered right to grow 6 plants. It's to possess 6 plants. By definition, if it's not being cultivated, it's not going to survive. So that's the kind of the framework that we've been looking at, is the presumption that 6 plants per person is.
Oh, not marijuana worth of 6 plants. We're talking about 6 plants. Okay. I don't know what it means to have 6 plants you're not growing, but I guess my concern would be that, like, most houses have 2 adults in them, so I don't know if it's a constitutional problem to say even though there's two adults in most houses, you can only grow 6 plants total. So that's just my.
Yeah, and I think that's
with the proposed, but there's some discussion of changing it to 6 instead of 12, and I think that would be the I don't know to what extent that's a concern constitutionally, but it seems like it might be.
Well, it all goes to reasonableness. If we have impacts we're attempting to mitigate, can we put reasonable limits on the activity that happens in the residence as opposed to the rights provided by the Constitution? We don't want to regulate those. We want to regulate what happens in our neighborhoods, and those restrictions have to be reasonable. And obviously, the greater the restriction, the greater the chance that it would be determined to be overreaching. But there's no magic number.
And do we have any sense of how many plants a person can use? Like a person who's using medical marijuana, how many plants do they really use in a?
Chief has some thoughts on that.
Well, I think when the original medical marijuana ordinance was passed, the rule of thumb was 6 plants or up to 1 ounce of marijuana. So there was this, and that was per person. So there was this sense that 6 plants equals 1 ounce of marijuana, and that's a reasonable amount.
Okay, thank you.
Are we You don't say that. Yeah, the puns are starting early. Are we differentiating between medical and recreational in number of plants you can grow, or are we not?
This proposal would not differentiate, and that's part of the simplicity of it is
Right.
you get to count your 10 fingers plus 2. If it's 12, that's the limit, and it doesn't matter. As you summarized the proposal, it occurred to me that we might want to make the distinction that the one place where we're suggesting there is a difference is in that affirmative defense, because there's an overlap, because the law says you can be a caregiver even if you're 18 years old, and you can be a patient under 21. So those are kind of the outliers, the exceptions, where we have to make some accommodation for the fact that someone might be a patient and have the right to possess what we're otherwise prohibiting, or someone might be a caregiver who otherwise would not be able to possess the product.
Just as a point of information, I would like to know how many complaints we have responded to over the last 12 months. And to me, that goes to a potential standard of reasonableness as we hone in on some of this information.
That's right. We can get that information for you, and you're absolutely right. The degree, the likelihood of a problem and the severity of a problem are factors that you would look at in deciding what's a reasonable set of regulations.
Right. And that standard of reasonableness would be to keep us out of having to defend something. So,
if at all possible.
Okay. All right. Great. Good job, guys. So we'll see that. We'll see some. Well, we have first reading on the 14th, second reading on the 28th.
Right.
What else? What will we have information in the intervening time?
We can do whatever you'd like. If you'd like to see the draft in advance of the usual deadline, we can provide something. We get the answer to the question you just posed, certainly, about the number of complaints.
Okay. Well, I guess as soon as we get a draft, something, if it's before Friday the 11th, that'd be great.
If we could get it even like a week ahead of time, if that would be possible.
We can certainly do.
Because it's legislative, I would like the opportunity to be able to make some phone calls and get some information. So if we could have it at least a week ahead of time, that would be helpful. Thank you.
One more comment. We can also make this PowerPoint presentation available to you, which says what will be in the ordinance, but it's in bulleted form, so it might be easy access for you. Would you like that? We're happy to do that.
All right. Thank you very much. Great work, and thank you, Council. It was good discussion tonight. Reports. I just want to mention that we lost a friend and real supporter of a lot of business in the city. Paul Aguilar was director of sales and marketing at the Sheraton Denver West Hotel, and Paul was actually here 2 weeks ago testifying on the ICCS issue with Brianna Miller, the general manager. Paul, lost his wife suddenly and unexpectedly last October, and Paul himself passed away last weekend at the age of 48. It's just an incomprehensible tragedy. Our sympathies are certainly with the son and daughter who survive, and with all our friends at the Sheraton. Paul was just a gem. He and I really connected as I was a veteran of the hotel business, as you all know, and kind of in his business. So big supporter of a lot of events that we did over there. So, he was training. He trained hard for an event. He was participating in the event, and he unfortunately passed away during that. So again, our heartfelt sympathies to his family at the Sheraton and his surviving son and daughter. Thanks. Adam? Karen?
No report.
Tom?
There was a opening ceremony for the outdoor classroom at the Patterson Head Start location. And two things are cool about that. One is I can't really describe to you why it's so cool to have an outdoor classroom. You have to see it, right? There's all these different areas to play and things for the kids to do, and it looks beautiful and uplifting. And but the other thing that's really cool about it is that so many businesses were involved in creating it. It was a real collaborative effort. So the plants were donated, and wood was donated, and wood chips, and I can't even remember everything. There was a whole list of Ace Hardware and Front Range Lumber, and so it was great to see everybody coming together.
Michelle? Tim? Kathy?
Yes, a reminder that next week on August 24th is our budget study session, and the meeting begins at 6 o'clock here in this site. Thank you.
And we're also contemplating an executive session on the 24th.
Yes, we are on the 24th, right after
the
that study session.
Okay.
Yeah, and the executive session is an LRA executive
for the
session.
Lakewood Reinvestment Authority.
That's right.
Okay, great. Thank you. We are adjourned.